Orchestrated fresh narrative with avoided names, financial details, and emotional arc matching channel formula. Orchestrated fresh narrative with avoided names, financial details, and emotional arc matching channel formula. My name is Maureen Vance, and I learned how it feels to be deleted from a family while sitting at a table I had paid for, holding a glass of champagne I couldn't bring myself to drink. It was the second Saturday in October, the kind of crisp Ohio evening where the light goes gold and everybody pretends the cold isn't coming. The country club outside Cleveland had strung little bulbs through the trees, and the band was playing something soft, and 200 people were laughing the way people laugh when somebody else is footing the bill. I had on a navy dress I'd bought at Dillard's and had taken in twice, because the chemo a few years back had carved the weight off me and never gave it all back. I'd done my hair myself. I'd put on the pearl studs my own mother left me. And I sat there with my hands folded in my lap and my heart so full it ached, watching my daughter glow in the middle of the room she was about to own. Because that's what the night was, not a wedding, a grand opening. My daughter had just made partner at her firm, and instead of a quiet dinner, she'd thrown herself a party that cost more than my first car, and I had been glad to help pay for it, the same way I'd been glad to pay for everything else. I sat near the back, table 11, between an empty chair and a man I'd never met who spent the whole night on his phone. I told myself the seating didn't mean anything. I told myself a lot of things that night. When she tapped her glass and stood up, I felt that old pride swell in my chest until it hurt. There she was, my girl, in a dress the color of champagne, the spotlight catching her like she'd been built for it. I had been waiting 41 years for a moment like this. I sat up straighter, the scar on my throat pulled the way it always did, that thin pink line from the thyroid surgery, and I lifted my chin anyway. I wanted to be ready to catch her eye. I want to thank the woman who made me who I am, she said into the microphone, and my breath caught, and then she turned. She turned away from me. She turned toward the far table where her father sat with his wife, and she lifted her glass toward that woman, the woman he left me for, the woman 12 years younger with the spray tan and the bright capped teeth. And she said, "My mother, the strongest woman I know. She raised me to never settle." The room applauded. Glasses clinked. Her father's wife pressed a hand to her chest and dabbed at a tear that wasn't there. And then, like she was remembering she'd left the porch light on, my daughter glanced toward my table and laughed a little and added, "Oh, and that's Maureen, everybody. She's helped out around my place for years, keeps things spotless. Honestly, I don't know what I'd do without good help." Give her a wave. A few people waved at me. A few people laughed, the polite kind of laugh you give when you don't quite get the joke but want to be agreeable. The man next to me looked up from his phone, looked at me, and looked back down. I want you to understand something, whoever you are, wherever you're watching this from. I have buried both my parents. I have sat in waiting rooms while a surgeon scraped a tumor off my voice box. I have worked Christmas mornings in scrubs while other women opened presents with their kids. And not one of those things did to me what one sentence from my own daughter did in that room. Help. Spotless. Good help. She reduced 35 years of my life to a vacuum cleaner. I didn't cry. I want that on the record. My face went hot and my ears rang like I'd stood too close to a speaker. But I held my chin where it was, and I let my mouth do the smallest thing that could pass for a smile. I would not give that room the show. I set down the champagne I never drank. I smoothed the navy dress over my knees. And then I picked up my purse and I stood, and I walked out of the party I had paid for, past the little gold lights in the trees, into the parking lot where the cold finally got to do what it had been waiting to do all evening. Nobody followed me. That's the part that took the longest to swallow. 200 people, and not one came out to see if I was all right. I sat in my Camry with the engine off and my hands on the wheel, and I did not break down. Something else happened instead. Something quieter and a great deal more dangerous. Because as I sat there in the dark, listening to the muffled bass from inside, I started to do arithmetic, and I realized, with a calm that frightened me a little, that my daughter had just humiliated the one person in the world who could take everything she was standing on and walk away with it. Let me back up. You can't understand the size of what happened that night without knowing the size of what came before it. I grew up the youngest of 5 on the west side of Cleveland, in a neighborhood where the men worked the steel and the women worked everything else. My father drank his paycheck more weeks than not, and my mother cleaned other people's houses to keep ours, and I watched her come home with her hands cracked open from bleach, and never once heard her complain. I swore I'd do better. I went to nursing school on loans in grit, and I became an operating room nurse, and for 35 years I stood at the elbows of surgeons and handed them what they needed before they knew they needed it. It is good work. It is the kind of work that wears your body out and asks you to smile anyway. I married young to a man with a salesman's charm and a coward's spine. He sold commercial insurance, and he was very good at the selling and very bad at the rest. We had one daughter. I loved that child like a house on fire. And for a while, for a few years there in the 80s and 90s, we had something that looked like a life. A little Cape Cod in Lakewood, a swing set in the back, Sunday dinners. Here is the thing I did that turned out to matter, though I had no idea at the time. In 1989, my uncle passed and left me a small inheritance, not much, $11,000. My husband wanted to put it into a boat. I put it into a building instead. A 2-story brick storefront on Detroit Avenue with a beauty parlor downstairs and an empty apartment up top, bought at the bottom of a bad market for almost nothing. He thought I was a fool. He told everyone his wife had spent his uncle's money. It was my uncle, but never mind, on a falling down pile of bricks. I kept that building. I kept it when he left me. I kept it through the divorce, through the lean years, through everything. It is mine free and clear, deed in my name, paid off 2 decades ago. Remember the building. It comes back. He left when our daughter was 16. Left for the spray tan, as it turned out, though she had a different name then, and a different husband she was leaving too. He moved an hour away, and his child support arrived late, when it arrived, and after a while it just stopped arriving, and I stopped chasing it because chasing it cost more in grief than it ever brought in dollars. So I raised her on a nurse's salary and the rent from that building. I co-signed her student loans for law school because the numbers didn't work otherwise. $80-some thousand with my name right next to hers, my house in Lakewood pledged against it. I have spent the better part of my retirement quietly paying down the part she fell behind on, and I never told her, because I didn't want her to feel the weight of it. That was my first mistake. There would be others. When she got out of school and got hired and started climbing, I was so proud I could have burst. And when she came to me 4 years ago and said she'd found the perfect spot to bring in clients, a renovated office, but the lease was eating her alive, I had an idea that felt like grace. The apartment over my building had sat empty for years. The beauty parlor had closed. I cleared it out, took a home equity line against the Lakewood house, $60,000, and built her a clean, professional suite up there with new floors and good light and her name on the glass. I leased it to her for almost nothing. A handshake, $400 a month, a third of what the market would bear, because she was my daughter and what's mine is hers, or so I believed. I made the HELOC payments out of my pension. She never knew that part either. You want to know how I had money to do all this, since people always ask. The answer is unglamorous. 35 years of overtime. A pension and a 401k I never touched. a paid-off house, one smart decision in 1989, and 1,000 small denials after it. The vacations I didn't take, the car I drove for 14 years, the lunches I packed. That's the whole secret. There's no lottery in this story. Just a woman who said no to herself for 40 years so she could say yes to everybody else. Now, somewhere in those 4 years, the wind shifted. Her father reappeared. Suddenly, he and his wife were at her firm dinners, at her holiday parties, in the photographs. He had a way of showing up exactly when the table was set and the credit was being handed out, and his wife, who had never once changed a diaper, or sat up with a fever, or signed a tuition check, started inserting herself like she'd always been there. She'd post pictures online, so proud of my girl, of a girl she'd met when that girl was already grown, and my daughter, God help me, ate it up. The father who left got to be the charming origin story. The stepmother who arrived after all the hard parts got to be the glamorous mentor. And I, who had done the actual raising, started getting moved to the back tables. I tried to say something. I want you to know I tried. About a year ago, at her birthday, I caught her in the kitchen and I said gently that it hurt me how her father and his wife had taken up so much room in her life, given everything. She told me I was being dramatic. She told me I was jealous of her happiness. She told me that her father had grown so much, that his wife was really lovely once you got to know her, and that maybe I should work on my bitterness before it pushed her away. I went home and I sat in my car in my own driveway for an hour. I told myself I was the one who needed to do better. That was my second mistake, believing that the problem with being erased was something I was doing wrong. So when the partner party came, I did what I always did. I said yes. She told me it would cost more than she could swing and the firm was only covering half, and would I be able to help? And I wrote a check for $38,000 without blinking. My savings. My quiet hoarded 40 years of saying no savings. I told myself it was an investment in my daughter's life. I told myself a mother does what a mother does. And then I sat at table 11 and got introduced as the help. Now we're back in the Camry, in the cold with my hands on the wheel and the arithmetic running. Here is what I knew that nobody in that ballroom knew. I knew that her entire practice, the suite with her name on the glass, the address on her business cards, the clients she'd built her partnership case around, sat inside a building I owned outright. I knew the lease was a handshake with no term, $400 a month, terminable by me with 30 days' notice under Ohio law for a month-to-month tenancy. I knew the $60,000 build-out that made the place look like success had come off a line of credit against my own home, in my name, that I had been quietly carrying. I knew my name sat on her law school loans, and I knew that I had been the one making the payments she'd missed. And I knew her father. Oh, I knew her father. Because in the divorce, 25 years back, my lawyer had insisted I keep copies of everything, and I had kept them in a fireproof box in the basement out of habit more than strategy. Records of the support he'd stopped paying. A judgment that had never been satisfied. In Ohio, a child support arrearage doesn't just evaporate because everyone got polite at parties. It sits there with interest waiting. I had let it sleep for 2 decades because I am not a vindictive woman by nature, but it was still mine to wake up. I am going to tell you exactly what I did, and I am going to tell you that I did it cold and clear-eyed and with no drink in me, because I want you to understand this was not a tantrum. It was a reckoning. The Monday after the party, I drove downtown to see an attorney I trusted, a sharp woman who'd handled my mother's estate. I laid it all out on her conference table. She listened without interrupting, which is rare in a lawyer, and when I finished, she said, "Maureen, None of this is illegal to do. The only question is whether you can stomach the consequences. I told her I'd been stomaching consequences my whole life. It was somebody else's turn. We started with the building. I gave my daughter formal written notice, certified mail, 30 days, that the month-to-month tenancy on the second-floor suite was being terminated. Clean. Legal. No insult in the language, just the facts. I did it the same week I got an offer from a real estate group that had been after that corner for years. They wanted to convert the whole block, and they were offering me more for the building than I'd ever dreamed, enough to set me up for the rest of my life with room to spare. Then we addressed the loans. I instructed the bank in writing that I would no longer be voluntarily covering the missed payments on the co-signed education debt. I was within my rights to stop, and I did. I didn't sabotage her. I simply stopped quietly absorbing a cost she didn't know I was absorbing. The difference is everything, and it is nothing. And then, the part that took the most nerve. I took the fireproof box to my attorney and I authorized her to pursue the unsatisfied support judgment against my ex-husband. 2.5 decades of arrears with statutory interest is not a small number in Ohio. It is, in fact, a life-altering number. I had every legal right to collect it, and I had simply chosen mercy for 25 years. The mercy was over. I want to be honest about how the next weeks felt, because the comments people leave on stories like mine always assume revenge is sweet, and it isn't. Not the way you'd think. It's more like setting down something heavy you've carried so long you forgot your arms could hurt. The 30-day notice landed first. My daughter called me, and the voice on the phone was nothing like the woman at the microphone. There was the practice, she said. Her clients, her cards had the address. Couldn't we talk? I said we could always talk, and I meant it, but the notice stood. I told her the building was being sold, and she'd need to relocate her office, and that I'd given her the legal minimum, but no more, and that she might understand now why a person gives the minimum. She got sharp then, the way she does, and said I was punishing her over a misunderstanding at a party. I said it wasn't a misunderstanding. I said I'd heard every word, and so had 200 guests, and that I had decided I no longer wished to be the help in my daughter's life. Then I told her I loved her, and I hung up, because I'd learned finally that you can love someone and still get off the phone. The loan letter from the bank reached her about 10 days later. I gather the conversation she then had with her father went poorly, because that was around the time the other thing arrived at his door. A formal demand through the court for 25 years of what he'd never paid, plus interest. I heard about the fallout secondhand, the way you hear about weather in the next county. His wife, it turns out, had married a man she believed was comfortable and unbothered. She had not signed up for a husband suddenly facing a 6-figure judgment and a damaged credit profile and a former wife who had decided to stop being generous. The proud stepmother posts stopped. The party invitations to the two of them dried up. I'm told she started spending more weekends at her sister's. I'm told things between them went cold and stayed there. I didn't celebrate it, but I didn't lose a minute of sleep over it either. As for my daughter, losing the cheap office she'd built her brand on, having to scramble for real commercial space at real Cleveland rents, suddenly carrying loan payments she'd assumed were handled by someone, somewhere, somehow. She had to look, for the first time in her adult life, at the actual cost of things, at the scaffolding underneath her success. And the scaffolding had my name on it, every beam of it, and the scaffolding had walked out of a country club in a navy dress. It was a Thursday in November when she came to my door. It had gotten dark early, the way it does once the clocks change, and there was a cold rain coming sideways off the lake. I heard the car in the driveway before the knock, and I knew the engine, and I sat in my chair for a moment with my hands in my lap, the way I'd sat in that ballroom before I got up to answer. She looked terrible, And I say that as her mother, not to gloat. She looked like she hadn't slept. Her hair was wet and flat against her head, and she had no spotlight on her now. No champagne dress, just a wrinkled coat and a face that had finally run out of performance. She stood on my porch in the rain and she said, "Mom." Just that. The word she hadn't used in public in years. I didn't step aside to let her in. I want you to understand that choice, because it was the hardest thing I did in this whole story. Harder than any letter, harder than the box in the basement. I stood in my own doorway and I let my own child stand in the rain, and I did not open my home to her, because opening the door had always been my reflex, and look where the reflex had gotten me. She started to cry. She said she was sorry. She said she didn't know why she'd said it, that it had just come out, that she'd gotten swept up. She said her father and his wife had made everything so complicated. She said she'd lost the office and she didn't know what she was going to do, and she was scared. And I let her say all of it. I didn't interrupt, and I didn't rush to comfort her, which every cell in my body was screaming to do, because I am her mother, and the mother's hands reach out before her mind catches up. I held my hands at my sides. When she ran out of words, I told her some things, quietly, in the cold doorway with the rain coming down between us. I told her about the $11,000 and the building everyone laughed at. I told her about the nights I worked doubles and came home to her sleeping and stood in her doorway just to watch her breathe. I told her about the tuition checks I signed with a shaking hand, the same shake that's in my hands now, the one the doctors say is just age and stress and nothing to fix. I told her about the $60,000 I borrowed against my own house to build her a beautiful office, and the pension money I'd spent every month for years, quietly keeping her credit clean, while she let strangers and a man who abandoned us stand up at parties and take the credit for the woman she became. I told her that I had never once, not in 41 years, introduced her to anyone as anything other than the best thing I ever did. And then I said the only thing that mattered. I told her I forgave her. I did. I told her I'd forgiven her on the drive home from that party, somewhere on the shoreway in the dark, because I'd learned a long time ago that forgiveness is a thing you do for yourself, to set the rock down, not a gift you hand the other person so they can pick it up and hit you with it again. I told her she was forgiven, fully and freely. And I told her that forgiveness was not the same as the door opening. "You decided at that party who I was to you," I said. "You decided I was the help. I'm not angry about it anymore, but I believe you. I'm going to let you be right. From now on, I'll be exactly what you said I was. Someone who used to do a great deal for you and doesn't anymore. You're a grown woman and a partner at a law firm and the strongest woman somebody knows. Stand on your own feet. They're good feet. I made sure of it." She asked if she could come in. I said not tonight. I said maybe someday we'd find our way to something, but it would be a new thing. Built honest. Built slow, with her doing the building for a change. I said the porch light would stay on. And then I told my daughter I loved her, and I closed my own front door, gently, and I turned the deadbolt, and I stood in my warm hallway listening to her car back out of the drive. I sold the building that winter. I paid off the line of credit and the rest of those loans, and I closed the book on every account that had my name tangled up with people who only remembered me when the check was due. I took the money that was left, and there was real money left, and I did something I had never done in 64 years. I bought myself a plane ticket. I flew to Arizona in February, while Cleveland froze, and I sat by a pool in the sun with a book I actually read. And one afternoon, I caught my reflection in the water, scar on my throat, shake in my hands, gray at my temples, and I did not look away. I looked right at her, the help, the strongest woman somebody almost knew. People ask me if I miss her. Of course I do. I miss her the way you miss a limb. But I have spent my whole life mistaking my own erasure for love, and I'm done with that arithmetic. I gave everything I had to a story where I didn't even get to keep my own name. And the day I stopped paying to stay in that story was the day I finally got to live in mine. So tell me, since you've stayed with me all the way to the end of this, if you'd worked your whole life for someone who handed your name to a stranger, would you keep the door open, or would you turn the bolt and finally, for the first time, sleep through the night? I know what I chose. The porch light's still on, but the lock is mine now, and so is everything else I ever earned. And at 64 years old, in the sun with my own 2 shaking hands, I have never once regretted turning the key. For most of my life, I believed that love meant subtraction. You take from yourself, and you add to the people you love, and the more you take from yourself, the more it proves you mean it. I subtracted 40 years that way. I handed my daughter every dollar, every double shift, every check I signed with a shaking hand, and somewhere in all that giving I subtracted myself right out of the picture, until a room full of strangers could watch my own child call me the help, and not one of them thought it strange. That was the cost of my arithmetic, and I paid it down to the penny before I understood what it had bought me. What I learned standing in my own doorway in the rain that November night is that there is a difference between being kind and being used, and the line between them is the one thing I had never been willing to draw. Kindness without limits isn't kindness. It's an invitation. When I kept quietly covering the loans, kept charging her $400 for an office worth 3 times that, kept writing checks and saying nothing, I wasn't loving her. I was teaching her that my worth could be erased and there would be no consequence. Children believe what we let them get away with. She treated me like the help because for years I had led her. And the day I stopped paying to be erased was the day she finally had to see what I actually was. I don't tell this story so you'll go hard on the people you love. I tell it so you'll be honest with them and honest with yourself while you still can. Look clearly at where your money goes, at whose name is on what, at who shows up when the table is set, and who shows up when the bill comes due. Knowing the truth of your own life is not bitterness. It is the only ground you can stand on. And it takes a backbone to stand there. The hardest thing I have ever done was not selling the building or making the phone calls. It was holding my own 2 hands at my sides while my crying daughters stood on the porch, and not reaching for her out of habit. Forgiving her was easy by then. I'd done that on the drive home. Refusing to trade my forgiveness for my own disappearance again. That took everything I had. So if you take one thing from an old woman with a scar on her throat and a shake in her hands, take this. Be generous, but never invisible. Be soft, but keep your spine. Love them with everything you've got and still keep the deed in your own name. I gave my daughter the strongest start I knew how to give, and I'm proud of that. But the strongest thing I ever did, I did at 64, alone, in the rain, with the porch light on and the deadbolt finally turned the right way. I kept the light on for her, but the lock, at last, was mine.